Hello and welcome to another edition of Consider This from the campus of IUPUI here in downtown Indianapolis. I'm Sam Graves. What we're going to be doing on this edition of the show is continue our discussion about a humanitarian intervention on the part of one nation to go in and save the lives of folks who may be under some kind of attack or violence or civil war going on in another state. And so this will be part two of that discussion. With us to discuss humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect are Dr. John Clark, who is an adjunct professor of international politics and politics at SPIA, the School of Public and Environmental Affairs here at IUPUI, and also our special guest is Dr. Brett O'Bannon, who is associate professor of political science. He's a coordinator of conflict studies program also. And both of you, John and Brett, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Thanks.
And now, as I indicated, this is part two, and there may be those in our audience who didn't see the first edition. We don't want to repeat that discussion necessarily, but in as much as one of the things that you teach and that you write about in an upcoming book is the responsibility to protect and how that responsibility kind of became codified by United Nations in the last decade and a half. So would you kind of give us a cook's tour of what it is?
Sure, yeah, just briefly, you know, the responsibility to protect idea is it could be viewed as a solution to a very old debate about human rights and sovereignty. Right? Do states have the right to intervene in the internal affairs of another state for human protection purposes, when sovereignty is such a long, sacrosanct principle of international relations? The thinking about sovereignty started to change towards the end of the 90s, and as a result, an International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty issued its report called The Responsibility to Protect, which drew on some ideas that had been kind of bubbling up since the mid-90s. One of those ideas was this concept of sovereignty as responsibility, as opposed to merely sovereignty as rights to be free of intervention and outside influence. Some were arguing that sovereignty implied certain responsibilities on the sovereign to protect their populations from harm. That was incorporated into this commission's report, ICUS report, and then what they argued in 2000 was that when populations face grave threats, genocide, you know, when there's in instances of mass human suffering, the international community has a responsibility to protect those people when the state in question is incapable or unwilling of doing so itself. In 2005, some of those basic principles were written into the World Summit Outcome document, which is a part of the international legal architecture now. And they narrowed that concept a little bit. Instead of natural catastrophes like the cyclone Nargis in Burma in 2008, they narrowed it to four, what we say, crimes associated with the responsibility to protect: genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And in those very specific circumstances, the state still has the primary responsibility for protecting its populations from these crimes. When a state, the international community, secondly, has its responsibility to aid states in their efforts to protect. And that can incorporate development assistance to help build up the state so it has a greater capacity to protect its people. And then lastly, when a state manifestly fails to protect its population in these four circumstances, or one of these four circumstances, then that sovereign responsibility transfers to the international community. The international community is said to have a responsibility for a timely and effective response.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned in the question to you, Brett, that it was codified in a sense by the United Nations, and I can understand why that is, because I suspect there's a distinct difference between the responsibility to protect and out downright intrusion or definition or invasion or regime change, any of the kind of things we talk about today. And maybe one of those topics we can talk about here in a little bit. But protecting versus intrusion and regime change, I think, are very important things. Could I ask a question that kind of relates to the easing of humanitarian suffering and what responsibilities the United Nations and indeed the members of the United Nations have? Let's just talk about Israel just for a brief moment.
Sure.
There's and Palestine. There are all kinds of human suffering. There's continuing violence, and depending upon which side you are, it's the other person's fault. But that being the case, what how would the Israeli-Palestinian example relate to or be included in this discussion of humanitarian intervention? Because you can look at hundreds of thousands of folks that are just downright out and out.
That's right. That's a great question.
To use a mild description.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. It's been discussed at great length by both proponents and critics of the responsibility to protect. We held a conference a few years ago at DePauw on this topic of humanitarian intervention, and one of the guests was Karen Abu Zaid, who was then just recently retired. No, I think she was still sitting Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief Works Agency for the Near East Palestine. Basically, she was head of the refugee program for Gaza and the West Bank. She came to talk about the responsibility to protect with respect to the plight of Palestinian refugees. Today, over half of all Gazans live in refugee status, right? And they are subject to the sovereignty of the Israeli state. Right? So, some argue, and this is my view, that Israel incurs the sovereign responsibility to protect the human rights of those over which it has authority. So I am one, and many others think that the responsibility to protect is particularly germane to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Whether it's the sort of structural conflict involved with occupation, or say the second Gazan war, for example, and the casualties associated with that. There are others who argue that this is actually a very particular kind of case, that the sovereignty, the RGP is restricted only to sovereign states and its own populations. So it would exclude a territory that it occupies, right? And so therefore RGP is not relevant to this problem. And that's a kind of narrow legalistic, I think, approach, but it's one that's been made.
I mean, in your discussion, you introduced a critical concept that isn't necessarily part of R2P, and that's human rights. In some cases, R2P seems as though it's saying that what really matters isn't state sovereignty the way that we've been thinking about it for the last 3.5 centuries. What really matters is the rights of human beings and the protection of those, and the responsibility of a sovereign state is to protect those human rights. There's no way you can look at the situation of Gaza and say that human rights are being protected there. And so whether it's a question of sovereignty or not, once you introduce that idea that there's a responsibility to protect and the driver of that is human rights, then that ambiguity becomes less ambiguous and the opposition to R2P becomes a lot more vociferous.
I just totally agree. One of the great shifts in international politics in the post-Cold War period was the emergence of individuals in world politics as rights-bearing subjects. What I mean by that is, during the Cold War, the community of states was the only kind of association in town. It was the only game in town, right? The only actors with rights were sovereign states. But once the Cold War came to an end, we started to see the emergence of a human rights discourse that was kind of coming into its own. And what that meant is that all of a sudden, in a world of sovereign states, individual human beings started to show up with their own rights to be free from oppression, to be free from mass human suffering. And I think so in that way, I think the responsibility to protect is just part and parcel of a larger changing normative environment, which does emphasize the integrity of human beings and the inviolability of their basic rights.
Can we talk about Syria for just a little bit in this discussion? If I, as Vladimir Putin, sign on to the idea of humanitarian intervention, the right to responsibility to protect, and my particular focus is Assad and the Syrian regime, I'm responding and reacting and protecting. Then the United States, on the opposite side, decides, well, it wants to be responsive as well and intervene there somehow. There are I guess where I'm going with this is there is conflicting responsibilities to protect over the same issue. Yeah. So how is that settled to obviate an even worse humanitarian disaster, which we could see happening?
Yeah, I think the Syrian problem, and it is a problem from hell, as Samantha Power would have said, is really important for us to talk about. I wouldn't equate, say, the responsibility of an ally that you kind of postulate here to sort of serve the interests of another ally, or one's own interest by propping up an ally, with the responsibility to protect a population from a state bent on its destruction. And that's clearly what we've got in the case of Syria. We've got a regime that is, well, I think one of the problems is that the regime, and I think with some good reason now, feels that it faces a fundamental existential threat, that should it fall out of power, and I think this is increasingly true with every additional person that dies on the rebellion side, that it faces its own extermination, this kind of reprisal. And it wouldn't be the first time that victims became killers, right? It's been shown that when governments feel that they face this kind of existential threat, genocide occurs. It becomes the strategy of response to that threat. And I think that's what we're seeing in Syria. And there are very few good solutions to this problem.
Well, you know, when we talk, or John, I think you were talking about Rwanda, what, 800,000 people died as a result of the situation there, and who would have thought that that was even possible? So the 100,000 that have died so far in Syria pale in the distance in terms of the extent of the tragedy, but still it exists. There are still 100,000 people who have died, and I guess the United States is starting to feel a little bit obligated to go in and help the opposition. How does that exacerbate the problem? Should either one of us, you know, we talked about the old Cold War days, and yet, you know, we see a kind of an emergence of Russia, and the pundits on television talk about Vladimir Putin sticking a finger in the eye of President Obama and that kind of thing by doing this. Is this kind of like a little mini Cold War situation there? Silly question, but it gets to the point.
I think it looks a lot, for those interested in this problem, you know, I said last show that something fundamentally changed with the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, you know, the principles of sovereignty were sort of inviolate, and we didn't intervene for humanitarian purposes. There were a few cases, India and Pakistan, and East Pakistan, for example, Vietnam and Cambodia, but very rare, right? Once the Soviet Union went the way of the dodo bird, and we kind of knew kind of thinking in humanitarian terms, we started to see interventions kind of explode. The UN went on peacekeeping operations throughout the globe. But today, and part of the explanation for that explosion of peacekeeping was a new harmony on the Security Council. It was no longer the Soviet Union and the United States, it was Russia and the United States. And now you no longer had that oppositional structure, and that freed up people to intervene. It freed up the Security Council to intervene. This kind of looks like the old Cold War structure.
Yeah.
With an important
let me make a fast break here, John, and remind our viewers that this is Consider This from the campus of IUPUI here in downtown Indianapolis. I'm Sam Graves, and we're talking with Dr. John Clark and Dr. Brett O'Bannon from DePaul University. And I interrupted you, John. Go ahead.
There's a big difference with the Cold War. When you look at the number of interventions after the end of the Cold War, you could say that's because of this kind of shift on the Security Council, new way of thinking about intervention and about sovereignty. But another way of thinking about it is that during the Cold War, you had on average these kind of complex humanitarian emergencies once every 3 years. After the Cold War, at any given time, there were 10 to 12 kind of raging. And so the Cold War itself, I think, kind of prevented some of those humanitarian emergencies from erupting. So during the Cold War, Syria wouldn't be the situation Syria was because the Soviet Union wouldn't have allowed it to get to that point. It would have propped it up one way or the other. Outsiders might not have made the kind of noises that France or the United States have made about protecting the civilian population. All those things would have meant that it would have been nasty, and life in Syria has been nasty before this, but you wouldn't have had that kind of emergency, and I think that's true for a lot of situations. So we're now in a position where the good thing about the Cold War, if you think of it as a good thing, kind of preserving states from imploding as often and as disastrously as they have been, isn't there, but we don't have the kind of consensus about when the international community and the Security Council, you know, will go into Syria.
Yeah, I agree. I think it has been said that the very nature of warfare changed around this time. Mary Kaldor, a scholar of this great repute, said we're actually now looking at new war, which is a very different animal. It is no longer state versus state in a kind of Clausewitzian way, but this is non-state actors and state actors. In Sierra Leone, you had soldiers that were rebels at night and then back into the soldier uniform during the day, called them sobels. And there's a lot of criminal activity associated with warfare and mass atrocity and targeting of civilians. I mean, the very nature of warfare and the change at this time, and states started to disintegrate in the end of the Cold War, and some connect that to globalization process. But anyway, I just agree. I think there's a different structure there in place.
But maybe that's why this is such an important conversation, because after September 11th, 2001, it became obvious that the world was different, that this was a kind of warfare that we hadn't imagined before, and that the international structure of institutions, norms, laws weren't prepared for this new kind of war going on around the world. The Bush administration recognized that it could have done one of two things. It could have said, we need new institutions, we need to build up those structures, we need a consensus, this is our top priority. Or it was to say that those existing institutions are fetters. They get in our way of doing what we need to do. And we know which direction they went. Yeah. And the only thing that came out of the Bush administration in terms of helping set up at least a movement toward those new institutions was R2P. And so in some ways, this is the only game in town, for good or for bad. I think, not necessarily for good.
It's interesting you mentioned the U.S. and the R2P, because the U.S. has, in some respects, been far from the front lines in the advancement of this norm. And in fact, at the World Summit, it was nearly scuttled by then UN Ambassador John Bolton. It was this classic 11th hour move by a number of actors that rescued R2P from American
all this Canadian intellectual imperialism.
One of the things we talked about getting into as we were mulling over the topics for the second edition of the show was Iraq.
Yeah.
And the difference between the responsibility to protect from a humanitarian intervention standpoint and what it is that the United States did in its invasion of Iraq now so many years ago. But let's talk about that just for a second, the difference.
It's critical. President Bush and Prime Minister Blair embarked on the Iraq War with very clear explanations. They dealt with the regime weapons of mass destruction program and a purported relationship between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, and thirdly, this responsibility for 9/11, the 9/11 attacks. Many months into the war, they couldn't find any support for any of these claims, and they started to shift their justification for the war to these humanitarian concerns. And Blair was really clearly connecting this to the responsibility to protect. And Bush himself used the notion of responsibility. This was just devastating to proponents of the norm, because it confirmed the suspicions of critics that the R2P is open to abuse. It is susceptible to abuse, right? And this seemed to confirm that, right? That we could wage, war for classic realpolitik reasons, but justify it in the most egregious way with humanitarian terms. One of the reasons that's compelling to me is shortly thereafter, Russia invaded Georgia because of problems in South Ossetia, right? And it was a classic case of realpolitik and kind of protecting the population and its interests, and so putatively protecting a population of its interests, but it was a classic violation, a very clear violation of international law and the sovereignty of Georgia and the rights of non-intervention. And one of the colonels on the ground was very clear. He said, if Bush can take Baghdad, we can take Tbilisi. It was clear, in some respects. I might, in other terms, look at Kosovo as part of starting this road to that. But Iraq raises it muddies the waters in a very dangerous way.
There were several other examples I know that we wanted to talk about. Brett and John, Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, some other areas. Do you guys want to just get involved in how those play into our discussion?
Yeah, you know, I think proponents of the norm look to the Libya intervention, the recent Libya intervention, as evidence that the norm has come, you know, kind of to fruition. It's really matured into a critical element of the international normative architecture. But it's not uncontested.
No, China and Russia feel badly burned by the fact that they gave Security Council authorization for what they said was a very restricted action of preventing a bloodbath, and the United States, France, UK interpreted that to mean, you know, essentially violating all of the arms embargo, supporting the rebels, supporting regime change, and leading to something that's no longer really a state so much as a bunch of tribes and ethnic groups fighting against each other. So Russia and China will say this was a disaster in terms of building up a support for R2P, because it is so clearly, you know, not separated from realpolitik and interests. And Russia then says we'd be idiots to do this again in Syria, where our vital interests are much more at risk than even Libya.
Yeah, there were, I mean, I think it's important to note that there were a number of very situation-specific factors associated with the intervention in Libya. You had regional organizations, the League of Arab States, for example, that were openly critical of what was taking place in Libya and called for intervention. And you know, there was this kind of harmony of interest, or at least a willingness on the part of China and Russia not to veto. They abstained in the vote. That is the coalition, or kind of coalescence of factors that's pretty rare, frankly. Right? But I think John's right that even those who, you know, advocate for R2P fear that Libya may have been the kind of height of the norm's trajectory, and the end of it, perhaps, because of the lessons that China and Russia seem to have learned from their abstention. They feel that that it was exploited by NATO, and that they went for regime change in a very quick way, that was in ways that were directly contrary to the wording of the resolution that authorized the intervention. And so it's really, and I think the downstream consequences of the Libya intervention are really important for us to consider when we think about the intervention into Syria today, right? Because we were intervening in what was clearly becoming a civil war in Libya, and that's obviously the case in Syria today. And one thing that seems to be true, it didn't happen in Libya, but intervening in civil wars tends to have the effect of lengthening them, which is not good for anyone, right? Okay. So I think it's a good cautionary tale as well.
Well, how has it worked out differently with Mali? Because Mali now is an intervention that was done without the United Nations. France taking the lead has been successful, unsuccessful, not just in a humanitarian sense of, you know, is Mali better off, are Malians better off than if there wouldn't have been that intervention? But what does that do to the principle of R2P?
Yeah. Well, I think there are, as is always the case, there are those who feel sort of good about the intervention. They point to the very quick expulsion of the Islamists that had taken over the north of Mali, the Al-Qaeda affiliates, for example, and kind of moved Mali back towards the direction of democratic elections and kind of state building. So there are those who think that this was a pretty good example of the effective use of military intervention for not only human protection purposes. I mean, there was clearly a political agenda there. That the fall of Mali to Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates would have destabilized the entire West African region, and that was unacceptable to anyone outside that region, or to those within the region. There was also a kind of growing humanitarian crisis associated with the Mali civil war, and so there were kind of both elements there. Some still look to the persecution, however, of Tuaregs in the north that's continuing today, and you know, it was Brazil during a recent debate at the United Nations issued this very important report called Responsibility While Protecting, kind of turning the tide on that. And you know, one of the things that's happening in Mali is of great concern is the failure to put a foot down on the persecution of Tuaregs that were associated only ethnically with the Islamists that took over. The
Tuaregs have been rebelling now for decades.
Yeah,
and you know, that's just a very different situation than the Islamists kind of forming.
The Tuareg rebellion was sort of usurped by Al-Qaeda affiliates.
We have sadly only a minute or two left of useful conversation time, and I wanted to, you know, while we can continue this, I'd like, you know, you have a book coming out that you, that a result of a conference held at DePauw a couple of years ago, and would you tell us a little bit in the 60 seconds or so about the name of the book and what it's about?
Yeah, I'm kind of negotiating. I want to negotiate the title actually with the publisher. It's coming out on Routledge. It's Evolution of the Responsibility to Protect Imperfect Duties, and it's got a number of leading voices in the field that are contributing to the book. I'm kind of concerned. It's got an Africa focus. It sort of seeks to assess the kind of current status of the responsibility to protect norm, and also to see how well it applies or how adaptable, suitable it is for the African context, where, you know, unfortunately, the R2P seems to have emerged out of the African experience.
Does it go into why that occurred?
It's going into, if R2P's been said to have kind of emerged out of the African experience of Rwanda and other crises, and my interest is to see how well suited R2P is to serve the interests of human protection in the African context.
Okay.
$155 when it comes out, so start saving up your money.
$155?
Yes. But worth every penny.
Worth every penny.
Yeah.
We're talking with Dr. Brett O'Bannon, who is an associate professor of political science and the coordinator of conflict studies program at DePauw University. Thank you so much for being with us. We'll have you back for sure. And also with Dr. John Clark, who's with the School of Public and Environmental Affairs. He's also the head of a think tank called Provocate, where they discuss issues such as this and many others. John, thank you very much for being on the program. And Brett, thank you. Again, the name of Brett's upcoming book is called
Evolution.
Evolution of the Responsibility to Protect Imperfect Duties. And it may be an imperfect title according to you. You may change it at some point. But nonetheless, it looks at humanitarian intervention. So with us on this second edition of the show, we have been talking about the evolution, if you will, of humanitarian intervention and why in some cases nations choose to involve themselves in the internal politics of others, and why in some cases they decide not to. And for Dr. John Clark, our guest, Dr. Brett O'Bannon, and all of us here on the staff of Consider This, thank you for joining us for this second edition of the program. I'm Sam Graves. Good day.